you've decided to devote an hour to cultivating your resilience. Just briefly, to me, as Amy said, I started my company 30 years ago. I've lived in Basel for 38 years. I'm originally from the US. And I do training and coaching in every aspect of communication, from intrapersonal, that is how you communicate with yourself, so the psychological end of the spectrum, through interpersonal communication to intercultural communication, all the way to the far end of the spectrum of business writing that's less psychological. I've also done a lot of work in executive presence. I've never actually worked as a comms professional, so I feel like an honorary member of this network. But several years ago, Peter Sandbach asked me to help develop a program for communicators at Roche, working on particularly executive presence and leadership skills. And so I've worked with, as a trainer and as a coach with many comms professionals, and I'm very happy to work with you this evening. The past couple of years, I've been working very intensively on doing stress management programs and resilience programs, particularly for Novartis, where for 2 years I delivered all of the programs in English and German for Wellbeing Switzerland on resilience and stress management. I've been working on developing my resilience for most of my life. I refer to myself as a recovering perfectionist, and I can't see you, so I don't know if any of you, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but maybe you can just silently ask yourself whether you have any tendency towards perfectionism, and if you do, you probably are aware, as I became quite early in my childhood, that perfectionists are very reliable individuals and deliver high quality, but are very good at creating stress for themselves. So my work is dedicated to helping my clients lead happier and more fulfilling lives. And that has mostly to do with helping them use their fantastic brains, which you see in the next slide. If you can go to the next slide, Amy. Our brains are beautiful, but they're also very tricky. And our resilience is directly connected to our life energy. And one of the biggest drains of our life energy is stress. I don't know if all of you are familiar with the acronym VUCA. It's commonly used to describe today's world, which is becoming ever more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, creating increasing amounts of stress for us. And when we're driven by our stress hormones, which are released from our limbic system, and if you look in the diagram, that's in the center of that very bright green area in the middle. That's where our stress hormones are released. When we're in stress mode, we tend to be reactive and have little or no access to our prefrontal cortex. That's the bright red part in the picture. And it's in our prefrontal cortex where our executive function resides, our ability to think consciously, to have empathy, and to respond thoughtfully. I'm not going to go into very much detail about the latest research in neuroscience, but I want to share a couple of pieces of good news. And the first piece of good news is that neuroscientific research has proven that our brains have what's called plasticity, which means that our brains can change. When I was going to school, I was taught that the brain develops itself until about the age of 20, and after that, it's all downhill. I never believed that, but it's been proven to be untrue. We can change our brains through how we think, the habits we develop, and also how we treat our bodies. So plasticity means that we can control our brains and manage our brains. And the other piece of good news that I'd like to share with you that I think is really important for tonight is that resilience is not a trait. It's not something that we're born with, but it's something that we can learn. The first step to developing ourselves, to growing, to managing ourselves is self-awareness and self-knowledge. And I forgot to mention that my background is primarily academically. My first study was at Yale University studying philosophy. So I'm going to offer you a couple of philosophical moments, and we're about to come to the first one. The ancient Greeks already recognized that knowing yourself is absolutely essential to being able to develop yourself. The oracle at Delphi was inscribed with "Know thyself." And this is going to be an interactive session. So the first exercise that I invite you to do is to answer the question on the next slide. What gives me joy? If you've got a piece of paper handy, great, take it and write down your answers for yourself so that you have them for later. This will be a short exercise of about 5 minutes total. I'll give you a minute or two to reflect and note your answers for yourself. And while you're doing this, Amy will put you into breakout groups of 3. And then we'll give you a couple of minutes to tell each other what gives you joy. Have fun. It's one of my favorite questions to open courses with. And there are a couple of things that I invite you to take away from this exercise. Probably the most important one is the power of attention. This is one of our attention is one of our most valuable resources. And what we pay attention to has an immediate and powerful effect on our state of energy, our state of happiness. And one of the ways that we can direct our attention is with how we talk to ourselves, our self-talk, and in particular, what questions we ask ourselves, and also the questions we ask each other. When we let our brains go into default non-thinking automatic mode, which by the way is how we spend 40% of our time in habitual mode, we have a tendency to be drawn more towards negativity. For example, around the dinner table in the evening, if you're not careful, you might fall into talking about the bad things that happen during the day. So I urge you to take this possibility with you and use it consciously and deliberately by asking, for example, inviting your loved ones and family to tell each other about the best thing that happened to them in the day. The other thing you can take away from this exercise, and I think you sensed it from what I heard about what happened in your groups, is that the state that we're in, our psychological state, our state of emotion and energy, is contagious. And there's also a watch out here that we take ownership of our ability to choose our state, and that we don't let other people drag us down. If we have a meeting with somebody that we know is kind of negative, that we don't fall into thinking, oh God, now I have to meet with this guy, but instead say, okay, how can I help this other person feel as energized as I do? So I said that resilience has to do with energy, and but let's look first at the way the word was originally used in physics. And we have a definition on the next slide, which is the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape, elasticity. But it also has a meaning for our minds. And now, again, I invite you to either take yourself off mute and call out your response or write your answers in the chat, sharing what resilience means for you, how you would define resilience. Thank you, everybody. Peter, did you use a dictionary or the internet for your first definition? Because in fact, we'll look at the next slide where I have 2 definitions that I think are very helpful. The first one is the ability to bounce back uh, and even be stronger through setbacks, disappointments, challenges, and failures, which we all experience at different times in our lives. And some of the original resilience or early resilience research focused on people who not only survived extremely difficult circumstances, for example, being prisoners of war in Vietnam, but actually came out stronger as a result and grew from the experience. And after this research was done, and the researchers looked at the skills and practices that were found to foster resilience, they realized, well, we can actually leverage these skills and practices to help people develop their skill and capacity to cope with situations of enormous stress and change. And certainly that pretty well describes the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. And um, I like to refer, there are a couple of images that I'd like to share with you for those who speak German. In German, they talk about Felsen der Brandung, so the strong rock that's being battered by the waves. An image I like better is a tree in a storm that has the flexibility to bend and not break. So there's something in there about flexibility. There's also a little toy. It's a little man with a round bottom, and you push him over and he pops back up again. That's another image that I like to use for resilience. These days, I've started referring to resilience as our psychological PPE, our personal protective equipment to deal with our very uncertain and rapidly changing world. And Lisa, you already kind of set off and started off on what I'd like you to do in the next breakout, for which I'll give you a little bit more time, namely 10 minutes. I invite you to spend 10 minutes in your group discussing your thoughts about what the practices and attitudes and skills are that you know that you're already applying, that you can do to cultivate your resilience. There, some of my absolute favorite things have been mentioned. I have a summary prepared for you, but and I'll go through this list in a moment. I just want to highlight a couple of the things that you mentioned. Learning and looking for what you can learn from a situation and how you can grow is really helpful in any situation. And in a small, even with the situation of regret that you just mentioned, Peter, if you ask yourself, let's say you screwed up in a big way and you start to beat yourself up about it, stop yourself right there and just say, ask yourself, what can I learn from this? So again, the power of questions can be helpful there. Breathing is conscious breathing is something that is essential. If we stop breathing, we're not alive anymore. But unfortunately, we often don't take the time to breathe. And when you take time to just become aware of your breath for 3 conscious breaths, that will already renew your energy. And there are lots of different techniques, but it's mostly about paying attention. So we're back to that theme of attention. I also think the principle that was raised of getting perspective, getting distance from the situation you're in, and you can combine that or add that after the 3 breaths. When you want to introduce a new habit, it's a good thing to attach one new habit or practice onto something you're already doing. So you can perhaps decide to take regular breaks of a few minutes of 3 breaths, and then invite yourself to get a new perspective on the situation that you're in. Movement, the self-care, that's the last item on my list, is really essential. And this, what you talked about, living in the moment, that's connected, you can connect to the breathing. And when, I think it was you, Rinika, you talked about everything always changing, which you can recognize through meditation, but you can also, I have a couple of mantras for some of the things that you mentioned, and one actually was almost mentioned word for word about perfectionism. I developed this at university. You said it, Janine, better done than perfect. And I said to myself, perfect is good, done is better. My godmother, who was definitely my secret Buddha teacher as a child, always said, this too shall pass. And I integrated that into as a reminder for myself that the world is constantly changing. And the list that I have here, and these are really this is the short version of a handout that Amy, you'll make available or you'll send in the follow-up afterwards. This is a list of essential resilience cultivating factors that I developed based on extensive reading in the research and my own experience. And many of these you've mentioned, focusing on your purpose and your values, what's important to you, what's meaningful to you, and that includes what gives you joy. Choosing to foster and cultivate a positive and optimistic attitude, which you can do again with the questions you ask yourself, with what you focus your attention on. One of the most important things is to be connected with others, which we're doing this evening. And I think all of our important relationships became even more important to us during the lockdown. Many people I have heard from, and I myself reached out to people that I care about who I had not been in regular touch with. And maybe that's something we can take with us out of this corona crisis situation. One that's a quite philosophical one, but really important to mention, that has to do with attitude and perspective, is both an important resilience factor and stress management factor, to actively accept what you cannot control. And that has to do with what you were talking about, Peter, with Emiche, about staying in the present, that you're not trying to control something that's in the past or in the future, but also that you recognize what's in your control, your attitude, your behavior, and what's not. Adapting a solution focus really helps you to focus on what you can do to move forward, to get unstuck. Somebody talked about getting unstuck earlier. And taking responsibility is really connected to that you look at what you can do, what next step you can take, which activates what's called self-efficacy, that you have the sense that you are in control of yourself and your life, and that you can move forward. And finally, the most important and most essential thing that many of you mentioned is self-care. Sleeping is most essential. The research is clear. 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night are what most of us need. Eating well, exercising, whatever it is that you love doing. If there's another lockdown, Peter, maybe you can dance along to videos of Morris dancing. Whatever it is, connect it with your joy, whether it's yoga or jogging or walking or bicycling or dancing. Definitely keep moving. So that's my list. To close, I'd like to just say that something that we haven't explicitly named, that I deeply believe is the greatest power in the universe, is love. And the first person that I need to love is myself. And we tend to be socialized to believe that putting ourselves first, our well-being, our health is somehow egotistical or selfish. But love is an abundant resource. And the more we give love to ourselves, the more we have for other people. And I have worked in my own developmental path a great deal with rituals and symbols, which are a gentle, loving way to remind yourself of what you want to cultivate, what you want to focus your attention on. And to wrap up, I want to share a practice of mine, which is to always have a rose in the room where I work. And this practice started over 30 years ago when I worked for Roche and decided to buy myself a bouquet of flowers every Monday morning to remind myself that I was having a good week. And every time I looked at the flowers, I remembered I was having a good week. And I invite you to think about, or let your unconscious mind present you in the next 24 hours with a symbol that can remind you of whatever you would like to implement as a result of this workshop. I'm really happy that you all joined. Thank you for joining. Thank you for organizing, Amy, and I'll hand over to you to see if anybody wants to pose some questions or have a discussion.